Okay. Um, One of my favorite foods. Okay. You know, we've been getting this stuff for a long time about fats are bad. I don't buy it. Without fat, a ribeye steak would not taste like a ribeye steak. Pretty simple. So how can you say fats are bad? I mean, the fact that you might stroke out later in life, I mean, it's a minor price to pay for something that is just so delicious. Plus, this business about margarine. No one should use margarine. It's not any better for you than butter, and butter is much better. The trouble is, there's something called food science that it's a misnomer. It's not. Nutrition science. They've always come out with these guidelines on what you should eat and why. Well, a lot of those guidelines were assumptions that were never tested. One of those was fats. Now, it's true. You probably should not overdose on saturated fats, animal fats. But once in a while, it's not going to hurt you, that's for sure. And the reason nutrition science actually isn't really a science, like I said, is because a lot of the guidelines have never actually been tested. Furthermore, we get cholesterol is a molecule that contains fat and needs fat, right? And supposedly cholesterol, high cholesterol levels in the blood are bad for you, and that's why a lot of people take statins. The thing is, it turns out very little cholesterol from your food actually goes directly into your blood. Okay? Cholesterol is made in the liver, and that's where almost all of your cholesterol comes from. Of course, the cholesterol that's made in your liver is from a lot of the food that you have digested and absorbed. So it doesn't mean that there isn't a connection, but high cholesterol levels are something of a metabolic disorder more than anything. And it's a metabolic disorder that's environmental specific. So when we learned about evolution, we realized some alleles are beneficial in certain environments and not in others. So in terms of nutrition, I want you to think about that. Okay. Now, so here's our phospholipid bilayer. Oh, God. Okay, better. So here's the fatty tail, as you can see right there, phosphate head. Okay, good. Now we can synthesize most fats from scratch. Remember when we were talking about amino acids? Yeah. Oh. So here's our phospholipid bilayer. So fatty acids, that we can't get from our diet, or that we can't make ourselves, are called what? What? Scurvy? No, essential. Remember about, I don't know what that is. Oh, was it? Okay. Okay. Oh, scurvy. Oh, no, that's vitamins, yeah. And those are all essential because you have to get them from the diet. Right. So, but if you remember from amino acid, there are some that you can get that we make and some that you actually have to get from your diet. So there are some fatty acids, there's a lot of different kinds, that are essential. Okay. Now there's basically two kinds of fatty acids. There's saturated and unsaturated. The bad ones are supposedly the saturated ones. Saturated fats are solid at room temperature, but it's because of its chemical structure. It's just a whole bunch of carbons and hydrogens on either side. Okay? And then we've got these oxygen and carbon groups. Now, unsaturated, it's got a kink in it. It's a double bonded carbon, and because of that, it doesn't stack up and it won't form a solid at room temperature. Okay? Now you can actually make this a solid, any kind of liquid fat, whether it's olive oil or vegetable oil or whatever, just by actually something called hydrogenation, that you add hydrogens to it. So, animal fats are generally saturated. Not all of them. There are some plants, but mainly they are. Unsaturated fats are mostly plants. Now, and they're unsaturated or polyunsaturated because they don't have as many hydrogens attached to your carbon backbone polymer. So we can make fats saturated by adding hydrogens. And partially hydrogenated fats are trans fats. Okay, now supposedly unsaturated fats are better for you. And one of the reasons supposedly is that they're not as high in cholesterol, and whereas saturated fats, it used to be thought that they dumped cholesterol right into your bloodstream. Let's see if I guess so. but that's not true. Okay. At the same time, like I said, I wouldn't really go overboard on fats. I had friends who used to work in the logging industry, make side money for college, and it's really grueling work. And they would commonly start out with a breakfast of about 6,000 calories. Okay, I mean, they would just pile it on. You'd think, well, if one of us did that, we'd pick right over, right? But they burned it all up. Okay. Now the thing is, like I said, most cholesterol is made in our liver, and there is a connection between animal fats, the cholesterol made in our liver, the amount, and then the amount that's in our bloodstream, and what's called fatty liver disease, which is becoming more and more prevalent. So, the reason cardiovascular disease, supposedly you have much greater risk from saturated fats. You can actually feel your arteries snapping shut like castanets. Okay, now, fats, as I mentioned, they're not only used for energy reserves and for our phospholipid bilayer, but they're used as part of cholesterol. So cholesterol is a steroidal hormone. There's a number of different kinds. It's not water soluble because it's got lipid-based particles that carry it. So it's a combination of a protein and a lipid. Testosterone is another steroid hormone, estrogen. There's a bunch of them. Not all of them has to do with sex hormones. Now, there's you've probably heard that there's different kinds of cholesterol. There's high-density lipoprotein cholesterol, that's HDL, and low-density lipoprotein, LDL. And the HDL cholesterol is generally beneficial. So some people take certain drugs to increase the level of HDLs. Mostly people take statins, which reduce the level of LDL, which are the kinds of things that clog your arteries and cause arterial sclerosis. And then, of course, heart attacks, strokes, things like that. Triglycerides are partly behind body fat, and statins reduce those as well, from what I understand. So statins, like Lipitor and things like that, they're very commonly used now. They've certainly reduced the incidence of cardiovascular problems and death from heart attacks, strokes, things like that, over the last 10 years. Okay. Now we're going to get to carbohydrates. Now, carbohydrates are sugars. They can be simple sugars or simple carbs, or they can be complex. They form long chains as well, mainly because with fats and with sugars and amino acids, it's all carbon-based, and you can make long chains. So, simple carbs are things that have lots of sucrose in them, table sugar, that kind of stuff. Easy to break down. They're usually, sucrose is a disaccharide. Di means two, saccharide means sugar. And they are easily broken down into a glucose molecule, which is what our body really needs in terms of energy sources. Potatoes are complex carbohydrates. That means there's long chains of saccharides, monosaccharides stuck together. They take longer to break down, but they're not really all that great for losing weight. And then there's another kind of carbohydrate, it's called cellulose, forms dietary fiber. Most of plants are made up of cellulose. We can't digest it. Some animals can because of the bacteria they have. So carbohydrate, carbon, hydrate is water. The general formula for a carbohydrate is some number of carbon molecules, X, and for every one of those, there's a water, H2O, and then there's oxygen, some number, or actually it's H2, that's right, and then some number of oxygens, and for each Y, there's also this corresponding hydrogen. Now, oh yeah, carbohydrates also are part of our DNA. They form the backbone, but we'll get to that later. You don't have to remember that. Okay. Now we can take a look and see. We have monosaccharides like up on top. Glucose, this is what our cells actually need when they uptake carbohydrate. They cannot uptake a complex carbohydrate or even a disaccharide. Disaccharides include sucrose, lactose. Remember we talked about lactose and lactose tolerance and all that. And then there's polysaccharides, long chain saccharides, or long chain carbohydrates. Now, a lot of plant-based carbohydrates are starch, which is we can use to break down into simpler monosaccharides, and then there's cellulose, which we can't. Basically, it'll pass through our gut. Cows and other ruminants can digest cellulose. Termites can digest cellulose, but they have bacteria in a symbiotic relationship that actually breaks down the cellulose so that they can use it, and then of course the bacteria get benefit from getting fed all the time. So here's our starch, potatoes. That's the kind we can actually digest. And then all the leafy stuff is the part that we can't digest in terms of getting glucose out of it. Fiber, you've probably heard, is pretty good. It increases intestinal motility, in other words, or mobility. In other words, food goes through it, helps it go through, makes you regular, all that. It affects cholesterol balance, and it also slows down the absorption of sugars, especially simple sugars. So, anybody in here like fruit? How about a Hershey's bar? Never mind. Okay, fruit. Now, a lot of fruit has very simple sugars, fructose, okay? It's a monosaccharide. And you would think that it would be absorbed immediately, but as part of fruit, a lot of fruit has fiber in it, so it actually slows the absorption of the sugar. Like watermelon is usually very sweet, right? And you think it would get right into your bloodstream or right into your digestive tract and digestion and all that. But it turns out there's a lot of fiber there, and so it really slows it. So you can pretty much eat as much fruit as you want. Now, cellulose, of course, I just talked to you about that, about symbiotic bacteria that help them digest cellulose. So they don't do anything with it. Okay. Complex carbohydrates, they are digested slowly, and they have to be broken down into simple sugars. And you would think that because they're digested slowly, they would probably be good for controlling high cholesterol, high blood sugar and things like that, and losing weight, but it's not the case. So everything from potatoes, carrots, yams, rice, pasta, wheat, that kind of stuff. Simple sugars are broken down rather quickly. Okay. I'll go to that one in a second. Now, so this is the basic look at glucose metabolism. Insulin is one of the primary hormones for glucose metabolism. What happens is glucose enters the cell. Actually, it's the mitochondria, and the cell. That's right. And then it's either turned into glycogen, which can be stored, or is used right away. So, here's our insulin molecule. Here's an insulin receptor. When the insulin is brought into the cell, it allows the use of glucose, okay? And which can then go into a number of different cycles, whether it's a cell cycle, the metabolic cycle we just looked at, or storing it as glycogen. So we store glycogen as excess glucose, basically, and it's stored in the muscle and the liver. And it's readily available when our body needs it. Our brain can only use glucose as an energy molecule. Can't use disaccharides or complex carbohydrates. Okay. Now when we exercise, carbs are what we use first in the form of glycogen and freely floating glucose. Now there's metabolic rate. Now cellular metabolism is all about getting enough energy so then it can make ATP and do cellular work. We all have what's called a resting metabolic rate, at kind of a basal line, just for keeping ourselves going and alive. And then anything above that, then our metabolic rate goes up, and it requires more energy in. Our metabolic rate varies among people and in the environments that they live. So body weight and composition can affect metabolic rate. If someone, like an athlete, athletes usually efficiently use energy and burn up a lot of it and so they usually have high metabolic rates. More sedentary people usually have lower metabolic rates. Okay. And then there's a genetic variation in terms of our metabolic rates. And then finally, there is the environment that we find ourselves in. And that's the food environment. And food quality, in other words, let's say how much calories a certain food has and how readily available it is. Okay? Food environments change and have changed. The food environment that we live in now is a much different food environment than our ancestors did, or someone in Ethiopia now where there's a famine going on. Okay? So there's food secure environments and food insecure environments. And then there's also kinds of food that we would normally not find if we were hunter-gatherers. In terms of high sugar concentration. Now we can go out and get something with high sugar concentration easily, right? Candy, whatever it is. Food abundance, it's also a matter of, you just walk out, go to a grocery store and stock up, right? Well, there's also fats. In our old days, in the old days when we were hunter-gatherers, we usually didn't have easy access to animal fats and those kinds of things. Of course, when we walk down the street and we go by some place that's doing French fries, we smell those fats cooking, okay? And in the past, if we had been hunter-gatherers, we would scarf down all the carbs that we could get and all the fats that we could get. Okay, so I was talking about metabolic rate. Why are some people fat and some people thin? And how do you think that relates to metabolic rate? Anybody?
Maybe it's the rate at which their body lets the food pass through.
Or gets energy from it, right. So, people who efficiently burn up energy usually have higher metabolic rates. Okay? And people who don't efficiently, or they have lower metabolic rates, they require fewer calories. Okay? Now in our environment, remember, it's an unusual food environment. We don't live in the kind of environment we used to live in. Remember, this is about evolution and adaptation. If you're a skinny person, everybody loves you now, but in the days when we were hunter-gatherers or subsistence farmers, and there was a food shortage, those are the people that usually died first. They didn't have any excess fat. They also had a metabolism that was normally at a lower rate, so they didn't burn up calories as quickly, and they could hold on to their fat stores, and it would perhaps get them through the famine, and they could live, while the skinny people pretty much went kaput. Okay, so you think, okay, that's great. That's adaptive. Well, unfortunately, when you bring that sort of metabolic adaptation into a modern food environment, where there's easy access to simple sugars and fats, and as much as you want, you get what's called a metabolic syndrome. It's usually characterized by obesity, low metabolic rate, eventually cardiovascular disease, and type 2 diabetes. Those are all pathologies. Now remember, in one environment, those aren't pathologies. That means you're surviving a famine. But in an environment that we live in nowadays, where we have a secure food environment, it creates pathologies. It usually doesn't really affect you until later in life, from 40 or 50 years old on, but it certainly cuts life short. So, I just want you guys to understand that even though it's considered pathology, disease, it's not really, it's just a matter of the environment that we're in. Now remember, in a famine, there's a shortage of calories. That's the thing that you really need to survive it. It doesn't mean that it's going to help you survive to old age. It's short term. That's the main thing. You have enough calories to actually get through it. And in the past, of course, people didn't live all that long. I mean, there were people that did live to their 70s and 80s. But the percentage was minuscule. So the average lifespan 20,000 years ago was probably 30, 35. Most of that was childhood mortality. If you actually made it to breeding age, then you might live actually probably on average to 40 or something like that. Okay. Now, as far as diabetes, there's two types of diabetes that there's type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is an immune disorder. In other words, it's an autoimmune disease where, for some reason, our own immune system attacks our own cells. In this case, they attack the cells of the pancreas, the beta cells that actually produce insulin. Therefore, people with type 1 diabetes are insulin dependent. They need insulin every day that they need to either take in a pill form or as a shot of insulin. Okay. Now, type 2 diabetes is what we're familiar with in terms of the metabolic disorder that in our present environment manifests itself. Can be controlled by diet and exercise. Obviously, people who have what's called the thrifty alleles, remember alleles, means that they use calories at a slower rate. But at the same time, in this environment, they end up, because they don't burn up calories quickly, those excess calories are stored as fat. Okay. Now, in that little film that we looked at, we talked about ATP. And ATP is made in the mitochondria, and it uses an oxygen metabolism. And from that you can generate lots and lots of ATP. It's not one of those things you can store. You have to use it immediately. So here we have glucose. When you also need the oxygen. So animals and most everything takes in oxygen when it's generating ATP, including plants. And then, at the end, you end up with all this energy, 36 ATPs, plus 2 more from glycolysis. And you also end up with water and CO2. That's why we breathe out CO2. Now, it turns out plants, when they make carbohydrates, either starch or fruit, whatever it is, they use photosynthesis. And to do that, they reverse this pathway. They take CO2 and water and end up creating carbohydrates, saccharides, like glucose. Okay? So, and then they also release oxygen. So in other words, the oxygen we take in is from plants that have been releasing it. Now, the only available calories that we can use immediately are either glucose or glycogen. Once we go through all that, we can't use oxidative metabolism anymore. Okay? Then it turns out our cells are back to fermentation pathway, which creates very few ATP molecules, 2, and a lot of other things in the fermentation pathway, lactate. And so usually if you've strenuously worked out, you get to a point where your muscles start to really ache, and that's because of the lactase buildup. You basically run through all your glycogen stores. Okay, so under aerobic conditions, of course, then you get ATP and lots of it. Anaerobic, where there's not enough oxygen left, you've overused the amount of oxygen you can actually take in, then you're in anaerobic production. Now, once that happens, and you've actually, and then you're breaking down the fat too. Once you do go beyond that, then you're starting to break down actually protein. And this is what happens with people who are starving. So, also fatty acids can't be broken down anaerobically. So that's when you start getting muscle fatigue. Now, we measure the energy content of various food, or in chemistry, using a unit called a calorie. And a single calorie is the amount of energy it actually takes to raise 1 milliliter of water 1 degree centigrade. But we actually measure calories that we intake as kilocalories. That means 1,000 calories. So when we talk about calories, 3,500 calories with a big C, that's actually 35 million, 3.5 million calories, okay, of little c, okay, because a kilocalorie, that's 1,000 small c calories. Okay, you guys know what your body mass index is? Okay, you can easily figure it out. You take the weight you are divided by your height squared. Okay? Now, a a healthy range of BMI is 20 to 25. Anybody over 30 is considered obese. It's not the same as percent body fat though, but it's not necessarily a good measure because muscle tissue weighs a lot more than fat. And so if you're all muscle, then you could probably end up with a high BMI when in fact you don't have a high BMI. So there's other ways to measure BMI. One is to use a very light electric current. Current passes through fat versus muscle tissue at a different rate. And so they can compute BMI that way. Healthy body fat. Women require a higher body fat. They are on a monthly cycle that requires extra energy. And then when they're actually pregnant, and most specifically when they're lactating and breastfeeding, then they really need stores of fat. It costs a lot of currency to actually produce milk. So most women have higher body fat than men. Now I know that sometimes it turns out women who really exercise a lot, let's say marathoners, tend to sometimes not, their monthly cycle is interrupted because they don't have enough fat and energy stores to actually support that. So you can measure percent body fat by putting someone in water, how much is displaced. Fat is less dense than other tissues, it floats. So your weight underwater reveals your actual percent body fat. Okay. Now, energy balance. For the longest time, there was a model and it was a energy in, energy out model. In other words, to maintain a body weight, it was thought that you take a certain amount of energy in the form of food, and then you burn that same amount of energy during the day, and you end up with an energy balance that's, let's say, just right. And this model implies, of course, that there's you can lose weight or gain weight because of willpower. Now, I mentioned before this gene by food environment, our ancestral environment versus our present day environment. You or people you might know have been on a diet, and even if, let's say, they lost weight rapidly, they rarely kept it off. In fact, what's that program? Big Losers or whatever it is? So they've got people that were like grossly overweight. They lost hundreds of pounds sometimes. They got money if they lost more than anybody else. They felt great. And then it turns out every single one of them either gained back at least as much weight as they lost, and in many cases gained back more. And even eating less and less and less, they were not able to keep that weight off. Now, we were talking about this metabolic syndrome problem. Well, remember, it's designed to keep people alive during a famine. When you go on a diet, what does that equal to? Huh? Starving. You're a famine. It's a famine. You're basically putting your body into a famine, where it's going to do everything in its power. You don't have to think about this, to burn as few calories as possible, lower the metabolic rate, and to hang on to fat stores at all costs, and only burn them up when absolutely necessary. Your body doesn't know that, oh, you're on a diet and not a famine. Doesn't know that. It just thinks, oh, it's famine time. Okay? Now, that would be great if, let's say, you did that and then afterwards you go back on a normal diet and your metabolic rate comes back up, but it doesn't. It actually stays at a lower metabolic rate. In other words, you are burning fewer calories all the time. And that's why it's so hard for people to lose weight and keep it off. I mean, I know some people who, if I had to live off of what they live off of, I'd be a starving maniac, okay? Because their body had such a low metabolic rate, okay? So that's why it's so hard. That's why diets actually don't work for the most part, okay? Now some people can do it, but it's not a matter, food is, and hunger is not like something that you can, say, oh, I can do without it. I mean, when you're hungry, that's all you're thinking about. Okay, so we've been talking about metabolism. We've got types of metabolism: anabolic, which means building up. That's what anabolic steroids do. They build up and muscle. And then there's catabolic metabolism, where we break things down. That's where we break down glucose and glycogen and fat. And our muscles, so that way we can have ATP, and muscles can, use that for energy and all our other metabolic functions. Our organs need a certain amount of energy, all our cells do. Now, building muscle, if you want to build a muscle, apparently what you need to do is you need to stress your muscles out. And then it kind of breaks down your muscles. You don't want to do too much, obviously. And then your body comes along and starts building them back up with amino acids. And so you need amino acids. That's from your diet. And if you're building muscle, you need energy in the form of ATP. Right? So that's what it requires. Now, when you're trying to lose weight, the best way is to lower intake. So it's actually almost impossible to build muscle and lose weight in terms of fat at the same time. You have to do one and then the other. Muscle tone, let's see. Muscle tone usually has to do with, of course, the muscle, but also how much fat is on top. So you can either build muscle or lose fat, but you can't do both. Okay.